Hello, listeners and subscribers and viewers. I have a real life story that probably no one's going to believe, but I'm going to share anyways. And the title of the story is called Real Life Story, the story of Matthew. Now, before I get into the story, I just wanted to add a little bit of introduction into my life experiences concerning the paranormal. Now, when you hear this, you will probably consider me a little crazy or out there, and I'm fine with you having your own opinion about that. It does seem unbelievable. Anyway, after my pop-up, who was my dad's father, died, his soul had occasion to appear to me and two of my family members to let us all know that he was okay and that he was headed to the happier side of the afterlife. When my grandfather appeared to me, I was dead asleep. What woke me was a very familiar voice calling my name, which was his voice. Now, I was a little girl, probably 6 years old, so my astonished little eyes and body quickly had to adjust to seeing his spirit standing before me in all the glory that our Creator could muster for a soul. My grandfather had a very clear message for me, which snapped me out of severe illness and emotion, and also landed me with an ability to see those spirits who are often not believed in or seen by human eyes in general life. Anyhow, that is how I end up being able to see, hear, and communicate with spirits. And so goes this story, which I will now read to you. Now on to the story. I have friends who were ministers and had a shelter ministry that was originally based in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Over the years, my minister friends were able to obtain a fairly large lot of farming land up in Louisville, Pennsylvania. Over their years there, my minister friends were able to obtain a fairly large lot of farming land, and on this property was an old school constructed barn and an old school constructed house. My minister friends, believing and feeling that they had been abundantly blessed by the Lord Jesus, constructed an outbuilding to house homeless men, and they sheltered the homeless women within the farmhouse. The property was flanked by a lovely flowing creek and 12 acres of lush grassland. In addition to the bunkhouse for their homeless gentlemen guests, there were pens constructed for pigs and chickens. They planted a small plot of purple grapes, and in the barn there were horses and a cow, which was to be raised for beef. The resident homeless there at the time informed me that they felt a presence in the attic of the farmhouse, and they were scared to go up there to tend the beef that was salted and drying up in the attic. The funny thing was, the residents had no idea how right they were, that there was indeed someone, a spirit, in the house. For on a night I was sleeping in the farmhouse as a visiting guest, I was awakened to someone calling my name. When I was adequately awakened, I placed the glasses on my face, and there before me stood the spirit of a man who claimed to have occupied the land and the farm where my friends lived some 100+ years before. The story was relayed to me in pictures and in conversation within my heart. My spirit was both a story of joy and great heartache. The man-spirit referred to himself as Matthew, and he clearly identified himself as the spirit that the current full-time residents were in fear of. However, the current residents had nothing to fear. Matthew, in life and in afterlife, was a peaceable spirit. and he had no intent to frighten the current ministry occupants, nor interfere with the Bible-based living model going on the property. Matthew, as he called himself, was a family man who had acquired the farm property by sale some 100 plus years before my minister friends had bought it. On the property, Matthew clearly showed me the construction of the farmhouse and barn, the plowing and maintaining of the large vegetable garden, the tending of all the animals, pigs, horses, chickens, and cows, and the joy and relish of having a lovely wife and son. It was not clear how long Matthew and his family's life were happy, but it didn't seem to be for more than 6 years. Vaccines against deadly human and childhood diseases were not readily available 100 plus years ago, and neither apparently were antibiotics to the poor farming community inhabitants. Matthew's son was the first to fall severely ill in the household, and sadly the child did not survive the pleurisy that he had gotten stricken with. Many pictures of what the child had endured before his death were heart-wrenching. I saw a child sweating and screaming with delirium over an endless bout of high fevers, a child racked with coughing so bad that horror visibly crossed Matthew and his wife's faces. I saw a child who could not hold down food and water, who screamed that he was hot and thirsty, who alternately vomited mucus and fluid and food. The child's pain, wheezing, and suffering was clearly audible in the room. Excuse me. After an insufferable 2-week period, Matthew's son finally succumbed to his death. And with tangibly felt sorrow, Matthew and his now sickened wife dug a small grave and buried their only child. But sorrow was not to end for poor, dear, kind Matthew. His wife soon fell to the level of illness that their child had. Night and day, Matthew sat by his wife's bed in sorrow and horror. There were pictures given to me of Matthew lovingly mopping his wife's forehead with a cool, wet rag. There were pictures of Matthew holding his wife's hand and comforting her when she cried out in delirium over the endless bout of fevers. There were pictures of Matthew lovingly putting a cup of water to his thirsty wife's lips, only to have her vomit it back up just seconds after the life-saving water was given. There were pictures of Matthew's wife having reached the point of illness where she could no longer be pleaded with to consume even broth. And finally, on a cold fall's night, his wife gave one last groaning breath and died in Matthew's arms. The next morning, after Matthew's wife died, I was again given pictures of Matthew sobbing inconsolably as he dug his wife's grave. Sorry, but this gets me choked up. The tears and the look of pain were clear on Matthew's face, and so was the fear. Matthew had also gotten sick from his wife and son from being sick, and the knowledge of his own impending death was clear in his eyes. 2 weeks after burying his wife, Matthew was struck with the same fate his wife and his child had endured. Only there was no one to come to care for Matthew, and sadly, it took only a painful, horrifying week for Matthew to pass away painfully gasping for breath. After that, I was shown pictures of Matthew peacefully but sadly roaming the property, and one of the restful places he showed me was him in the attic, thoughtfully and sadly gazing out the window. From all that was said and shown, I got the very clear impression that Matthew was a sad, lonely soul, and this is why he roamed amongst my friends and their charges, and the property and animals. To this day, I still wonder if Matthew has finally found peace and has gone on to a better place. And to this day, I hope and pray that Matthew is in that better place with his wife and his child, happy, healthy, and free from the troubles and sorrows of this world. I will always think of Matthew, and I will always pray for him and his family. For what Matthew and his family suffered in illness seems so cruel and so unjust for a man who dearly loved his family and who had so lovingly cared for the property and animals that sustained him and his family.